Hello, I'm Juliet Chasney, Project Manager for the Literal Project. Welcome to this webinar, Managing the Complexities of Identity as an Ethnically Diverse Member of Staff in the NHS. It's really great to have you here today. If you would like to quickly say hello in the question and answer section and say where you're from while I'm speaking, that would be great. This is the third in a series of 6 webinars on topics relating to spirituality and religion as experienced by ethnically diverse NHS staff during the COVID-19 pandemic. These webinars are part of the Literal Project, which is a study funded by NHS England, and we have been conducting consultation groups with ethnically diverse NHS staff up and down the country to explore their experiences and guide us towards the topics for these webinars. How today's event will work is our speakers will have a discussion with each other for the first 30 minutes or so. Then we will open up to questions and answers. Everyone attending this webinar has their camera turned off and their microphone on mute. If you would like to ask a question of our speakers, please type into the Q&A section and the questions will be moderated by Sophie, who you will see a bit more of later. Please type in your questions as soon as you think of them while we're still talking, as there is a delay before we can respond. All of these webinars are being recorded and will be available on our webpage later. Our speaker for today is Dr. Riya Patel, who is a psychologist and behavioural scientist who works in academia and public health, researching the intersectionality of religion, spirituality, culture and health. She is involved with several projects that explore the role of religion and spirituality in a wide range of health conditions, such as breast cancer, obesity, disordered eating and domestic violence. She has an international reputation for her research into religion, spirituality and health, and has just developed a taxonomy of religious practices that have been empirically tested within healthcare. Riya is passionate about delivering holistic healthcare and is a huge advocate for improving health inequalities among culturally and linguistically diverse populations. Thank you for being with us today, Riya. Joining her in conversation is Reverend Dr. Guy Harrison, Director of the Oxford Centre for Spirituality and Wellbeing and Project Lead for the Literal Project. Over to you, Guy and Riya.
Thank you very much, Juliet. And my thanks to you too, Riya, very much for being with us. Delighted that you're able to join us today. We talked a little bit when we spoke about this particular webinar about identity and the crucial element of, we have so many different parts to us, don't we, in terms of our heritage, our role, our professional status, our family. You say a little bit more and help us with the topic generally, Riya, and introduce us to the complexities of identity, particularly if we're ethnically diverse staff working within the NHS.
Hi everybody, thanks for having me, Guy. Yeah, so this is a really interesting topic, particularly because identity is so complicated, and even as we start to kind of think about all of the different identities, I think this topic was interesting mostly because of the fact that when we are at work, who are we? When we're at home, who are we? And I think as we kind of progress through life, that question of who we are is something that we all find ourselves on a day-to-day, periodically just questioning, whether it be kind of when we embark on a new journey, or if, you know, at milestone birthdays, or if a sudden specific event happens. And I think identity is so complicated, and then when we start to look at aspects of identity and kind of wanting to address things that are core to our identity, you know, the solutions, and particularly some of the discussions we've had in the Literal Project itself, it kind of just raises this notion of, you know, who are we? And I guess that's something it's something I'm fascinated by, both professionally and personally. But also, you know, at what point do we give up certain identities and kind of give rise to more prominent aspects of our identity, or more appropriate aspects, or appropriate because, you know, it may not be what we want. And I think that's kind of, I don't know if I've kind of introduced this the way I'd want it to, but it's those kind of conversations that come out of this project and just kind of wider work that really just makes this an interesting topic to discuss.
Thank you. Yeah, and do you think therefore that in terms of our identities, there often parts of our identity can be squashed or squeezed, you know, or marginalized because, and particularly I'm thinking of ethnically diverse staff working within this pandemic in amidst crisis and change. Do you think that you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, my immediate answer would be yes, because there's and that kind of, it's kind of a two-pronged answer in the sense that I think we have various different identities, and, you know, and we have various different roles attached to those identities. So, you know, at work, you may be a manager or a doctor or a psychologist or, you know, a researcher, and that has its own responsibilities. And with those responsibilities, there's ways to behave. And then at home, you may be a mother, a daughter, an uncle, aunt, and again, they have separate responsibilities that you have to engage with. And there are times where I guess the roles or the responsibilities that go with a particular identity you're meant to uphold in a situation can then mean that, you know, you feel like certain aspects of your identity may not be appropriate to show. And for people of kind of an ethnically diverse background, it can mean a lot of different things. So, you know, in certain situations, you're kind of grappling with belonging. You know, as individuals, we want to belong. And kind of speaking from my own experiences, I am British born, so I identify with the British identity, but my parents are from India and Kenya, so I've got those aspects of my identity too. And in some respects, you kind of find yourself almost, like, so for myself anyway, and a lot of people I've come across in life, where do you actually belong? And there are certain situations where, you know, discussing your identity is seen as okay, but in other situations it's almost like my identity isn't important here, or my race isn't important here, or my faith isn't important here, so I shouldn't really be mentioning that. And I think sometimes in a sense, to find belonging, you ultimately decide, actually, this is going to be accepted and this isn't going to be accepted, so let me put forward this aspect of my identity rather than the other. And it can become a struggle, or sometimes more than a struggle, and it's something I'm still trying to get my head around, and I suspect it's the case for most people. So I think this pandemic in particular, it's opened up a lot of opportunities for some very difficult conversations. And I think, as horrible as this pandemic has been, there's actually some good coming out of it as well, because we're starting to have these difficult conversations around kind of identity and what makes us us, and some of the struggles that we may have previously faced to not be able to be open. So yeah, no, sorry.
Do you think it's I mean, it's obviously very hard to begin to speak about particular aspects of ourself and our identity. They're often deeply personal, deeply embedded within us. And I'm struck by what you're saying in terms of things. Often we hide parts of ourselves. That sounds incredibly challenging, difficult, stressful. How do we kind of find a place in which we can be freed from some of that? I know, you know, I'm hoping that certainly some of those involved in our consultations have felt a sense of freedom and a sense of opportunity to be able to talk about how they feel, but it's not always there. How do we do that, do you think?
I think whenever you approach any sort of difficult conversation, the most important thing is to just be open to listening, and it's kind of abandoning any expectations. But I think particularly when we start to have conversations around race, ethnicity, faith, there's almost this walking around on eggshells because we don't want to cause offence. And I think whilst our intentions to not cause offence are you know, admirable, and also we do need to acknowledge that we don't want to offend one another, they almost become barriers, because it's almost like, oh, we couldn't possibly talk about this, or you know, how, no, we shouldn't talk about that. That's, you don't talk about somebody's faith, or you don't mention their race. That's not something you do. And it becomes a barrier, because, you know, we don't want to open up the potential for offence, but by shutting down that potential, you're then also closing off a very important conversation. So I think, yes, we don't know all of the solutions, but the fact that we're beginning to have these conversations, even in kind of the Leisure project, the fact that we were asking people, you know, how has it been for you as a member of the NHS staff that belongs to a ethnically diverse community? How has it been for you? Just simply asking that question, there's some simplicity in that, you know, you're actually asking me something that I've never really been able to talk about, and I think it's the start, and you know, we have to start somewhere, and how that would play out is it's being open to criticism as well, because we all have a role to play in all of the different situations that have panned out, and things that are above us. Obviously, certain decisions, certain things, they happen, and we simply are not responsible, but there's a collective responsibility as well, and that, I think, is where the struggle currently is. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense, absolutely. So there's a collective struggle, you're saying, and it's then, I guess, is how do we, it's an impossible question to answer, I suppose, but it must be quite frightening sometimes, or we're anxious about how to speak up, how to actually sort of say this, to also reveal something of ourselves, because we might be, that might open us to discrimination, and some of us will have experienced that, often in some rather dramatic ways and very uncomfortable, if not downright negative and destructive ways. So how do we speak up? How do we kind of gain that confidence, if you like?
I think, I mean, you're right in that, you know, some of these conversations, when they happen, they're not always met with the response that you're expecting, or you're at least hoping for or anticipating to receive. And I think part of that just comes from, you know, nobody is comfortable with uncomfortability, and nobody is comfortable with being awkward. And, you know, in our various different ways, when we're trying to address an uncomfortable situation, or even if we take it in rather than a collective level, but at an individual level, you can have, so as an example, if you identify a behaviour that you might have engaged in, and actually you then think, I don't think I should have done that, you know, what are the feelings that come to light? So there might be some guilt, there might be some shame, and then initially, what does that cause you to do? That kind of causes you to revert back and actually just, to some extent, well in that, and kind of wallow in that, and think, oh, I can't believe I just did that. But to take that a step further, actually, what do you do from that point? You know, do you then make a conscious decision to make a change and not engage in that behaviour again, or do you just kind of accept that feeling in the present and then go on to do it again? And I think we don't allow ourselves, for lack of a better word, that grace, that actually we're not going to get everything right. So, you know, when we start to have these conversations, we're not going to get it right the first time. We probably won't get it right the first 10 times, but we need to make an attempt to try. And in terms of establishing kind of confidence to talk about these things, and confidence is to be vulnerable, it comes back to, I guess, the environment that you're trying to find that comfort in. So, for example, a closed group can be a very safe setting if that's how, you know, if that's been created, that space has been created. So that may be a starting point where, you know, we create these safe spaces for people to be able to talk, but then it's thinking about, well, how do you take that further? So, you know, to bring about a cultural shift in an organisation. And I think before you start big, you have to start small, and the small in this case is you start with yourselves. So, you know, sometimes it could simply be just having empathy for the person sat in front of you and the situations they're describing, or it could be, you know, I want to make a change for this person, so how do I do that in my day-to-day? And I think they're the things that in searching for the solutions we're losing, because we're looking for the big changes that we want to make, but actually let's start with the small changes and see where they lead. I don't know if that's kind of shed light on what you were getting at.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, small changes. I'm with you there, because we tend to sort of sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, we kind of don't think in terms of the society's got to change, our organisations got to change, our structures have got to change, but actually it's the personal that is really meaningful, isn't it? So I absolutely agree with you. One of the things we've discovered, though, isn't it, is that actually in the projects and the consultation groups is that people do feel as if their spirituality or their religious understandings are just not thought about, or it's very difficult to express them. And particularly if we are under such a challenging, and we're in a very challenging environment in our NHS trusts, having the space and the time, and it's great, yes, we could speak up, every one of us perhaps on this webinar thinking about it, but actually there will be many colleagues who are closed. That creates that's a stressful, challenging time, isn't it?
It is, it really is. In this, I think spirituality, for a lot of people, even the word, just simply the word religion, it already creates, it has a lot of negative connotations, I find. Even as an academic that researches religion and spirituality, whenever I say, oh, that's what I'm interested in, people just look at me like, what? Why are you interested in that? You know, what relevance does that have? Why does that, how does that relate to healthcare? And I think this comes back to having an openness, you know, when we kind of look at healthcare curriculum, training, these things, they're talked about, but not to the extent they maybe should be. And it's also, again, it comes back to the individual. For people that may be closed off to these things, there could be various different reasons why they're closed off to some of these topics. So it could be, you know, they may have had a bad experience with their religion or spirituality in the past, and so they don't think it's relevant, or they actually think it's too personal, so I shouldn't potentially go down and explore this with somebody, or actually it's just not relevant. And as with everything, it's kind of coming back to, you know, if we're thinking about it in a clinical context, what's important to the patient in front of you. If their religion and spirituality is important to them, then, you know, that it's not something you should then be arguing with, but actually, okay, let's identify what we can do with it. And so there's a competency issue then that becomes, in the sense that, you know, do you feel confident to be able to talk through somebody's religion and spirituality and how that may be related to their health? And then in a workplace organisation, again, it is simply, well, what role does their religion and spirituality play in terms of their role and their responsibilities, and how they fulfill those roles and responsibilities? So again, thinking about some of the things that I've come across in some of the research that I've conducted, somebody's faith, their religion, their spirituality can dictate how they behave, you know, how they approach people, what they might say, you know, what they might do. And it's important for us to know that, because at the end of the day, it's so core and so crucial to your inner being that you can't expect people to just park it at the side or compartmentalize it and just say, okay, because I'm in this role, my religion and spirituality can't exist anymore. When actually it's so intricate and so interwoven into the essence of who you are that it's crazy to think that we're constantly asking, or unintentionally asking, people to take, you know, to almost like unweave it out of their essence. And it, yeah, again, how we go about it, I don't know, but we really do need to start to have open conversations, but also make spaces for this to be okay.
It sounds very much as if you're saying, making space, as you say, being curious, being prepared to listen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is about making spaces and being open to listen, but it's also having a level of acceptance that, somebody can have a worldview or a spiritual worldview or a religious worldview, and it doesn't have to align with yours. I think if this pandemic has taught me anything, it's people can have different views, but you can still exist together. And I think somewhere along the way, we've lost that sense of community, but also that sense of being able to exist together. So, rather than trying to make everybody equal, let's celebrate our differences, because our differences are what makes us who we are, but it's also what makes us exist together as society. And in trying to make things equal and being politically correct, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, we shouldn't keep striving towards that. Absolutely we should, but recognize that if I like a pink scarf and you like a blue scarf, you and I can still live together and we can still interact, and you don't have to like my pink scarf and wear my pink scarf. You can wear your blue scarf and be content with that, and it doesn't have to affect me. Really poor analogy, but to kind of just really get my point across, we can exist together.
No, I do take your point entirely, and therefore being able to celebrate difference. We so often emphasize, don't we, that sense in which we have to be, we have to be all equal. Well, we're not, hopefully what we're working towards is equality of opportunity and equality of access and equality of in terms of what we're thinking in terms of diversity. We want to be able to celebrate, to be able to recognize and affirm each other's difference.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, how much do we want to continue to focus on the things that make us different? Because ultimately, to some extent, somewhere down the line, these things have started to separate us. By constantly focusing on the things and the places where we're different, what we're finding is actually we're almost separating ourselves to say, well, you're different, so you need these needs. And I don't know if I'm articulating this appropriately or adequately, but we need to acknowledge the differences, but not fixate on the differences. So, whilst we need to strive for cultural change, kind of at organisation level, individual level, we mustn't forget the things that, bind us together or where we're similar. And, there's traits that we should be cultivating, things like compassion, acceptance, empathy, and those traits, they're not exclusive to a particular race or a faith tradition, that they're an essence of humanity. And we shouldn't, it's almost like in focusing on differences and all of the different equality agendas that there exist, we're forgetting some of the core characteristics that actually, when they're there and they're active, these things aren't really at the forefront. When we're compassionate and respectful of one another, you don't look at the person's faith background or their race. You see them as a person first. And yeah, again, that's going to require a huge shift in our cognitions and our beliefs and the way of living. But I like to think, we will eventually get there. I feel like I've just given a candidate's president-elect speech, but
well, we vote for you, Ray. It's okay. We would agree. But I mean, in terms of how we therefore do, as you say, how we're open to each other, but actually how we actually also are proactive in terms of trying to change, because we do need to. There are structures and elements of being able to celebrate our diversity and our heritage and our personhood, if you like. There are elements within our organisations and within the NHS that actually prevent us from doing that. And I suppose that's coming back to not wishing to kind of go back onto a kind of negative conversation, but actually that's where people struggle, isn't it? That's where, particularly for me as a white British member of staff, I don't necessarily I won't necessarily know, and I need to know, and I need to find out, and I need to be able to inquire. I don't know, am I now making sense now?
No, I get what I know. I get what you're saying. I think there's, especially during this pandemic, so much has happened. You know, I remember back to one of the very first kind of focus group we did with the Leisure Project, and you know, within 5 minutes of running the focus group, somebody brought up the impact of George Floyd, and you know, it was to be expected, but the discussion that then followed, you know, if we look at, I'm a huge social media person, you know, I'm unfortunately part of that generation that cannot put my phone down and get off social media. But the kind of things that followed, the campaigning that individuals engaged in to kind of raise awareness, to talk about, that's just one aspect of, you know, some of the changes in attitudes that people are trying to push for, even within their own individual communities. But kind of, if we think about a structure like the NHS, it's kind of at a kind of corporate level. If we think about it, you know, we set up equality and diversity task force when we talk about kind of the things that we need to do. And I think we've kind of reached a point where, and I guess this is probably where my frustrations come in, so I'm just going to put my disclaimer out there. We need to go beyond that. So, you know, it's no longer about, you know, recognizing, or, you know, we need to suss out whether or not equality and diversity is an issue. We know it's an issue. We know there's systemic racism. We know there are lots of negative connotations and a lot of negative impact that has happened, and unfortunately for now will continue to happen. But what we do need to do is think, okay, how do we move forward? And to do that, you need tangible actions, and things actually need to be seen to be changing. So thinking about, if we kind of think about what an individual within an organisation could do and what an organisation can do at an organisation level, the leadership will probably need to change at some point. And I'm not saying, you know, we then need to have ethnically diverse people in leadership and they need to kind of take over. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, what are the characteristics of a leader? You know, how transformational are they? And how confident are they that they will be able to champion some of these changes? And they're the kind of things you need to look for. So for some individuals, you know, when I think about my white counterparts, there are some people who are probably in a better position than myself to articulate my needs just from a conversation with me. And that's just because they understand processes that I may not understand, you know, how to get across points and articulate points and be, you know, eloquent with what kind of changes and how to meet certain kind of leadership agendas or corporate kind of strategies. So they're the kind of people that we want to be seeing in leadership, because, you know, they may not have the lived experience that I have, but they're able to articulate my lived experience and move forward with it and get the change that I may not be able to on my own. But there's also thinking about, you know, what deliberate strategies can we put in place? And often what you see is, I'm sorry if this sounds really crass and crude, but, you know, there will be a little, to me, I think of this as a tokenist act. But there'll always be, you know, if you think about job applications, you know, we welcome people from ethnic diverse communities because they're underrepresented in an organisation. I'm going to be honest with you, if I know that an organisation has an underrepresented, like if somebody like me is underrepresented in an organisation, it doesn't make me want to work for you, because, you know, then am I the tokenist person you're then going to go on to hire to say that, you know, we're a diverse workplace? Or is this actual genuine act? And this comes back to meeting us. I say us and they. Even that language is horrible, because we're people first. But it's coming back to, where are these individuals who are affected by these discriminatory practices of the past and current practices and current, I guess, endemic in terms of racism. Where are they, and how do we convince them that the things that we're doing aren't tokenist actions? And that's, I guess that's where I will say we need a cultural shift in kind of how we approach these things. So, you know, at an individual level, what could we do? Inspect your own biases. You know, when you look at somebody, you know, you may be the person that doesn't see their race first, and that's fine. You know, that there's nothing wrong with that. But if you see somebody's race first, or if you see a particular sensitive characteristic first, so it could be their age, it could be their gender, it could be the way they're dressed, what kind of things come to your mind? And it's you know, you don't have to share those thoughts with somebody, but have an introspective moment where you sit and think, well, what comes to my mind when I see this person? You know, if I look at this person and I see that they're of a particular ethnic group, you know, what comes to my mind? And then how do those thoughts then kind of inform how I engage with that person? And I would like to argue we don't do enough of that. There isn't enough introspection that occurs. And if you're not that introspective about kind of your interactions, you then don't really know what you need to fix or what you need to address within yourself. So I guess to kind of exemplify that, we do on one of our courses at the university, it's a dietetics course, when we talk about weight and we talk about the patient's weight, we instantly say that, you know, there are a lot of connotations that go when you have a person that's sat in front of you who is overweight. It's widely documented in the literature, but also clinical practice. How do those biases then inform how you go on to treat the patient? You know, do you already have those biases in your mind when the patient sat in front of you? So are you making assumptions about their eating behaviours, their physical activity levels? Are you making assumptions about their lifestyles? That may not even be the case. And one of the things that we do is we get the students to think, what are those biases that come to mind, and actually how do they differ from a patient of a normal weight? And what would you do differently? And actually, it's only when we present the activity or present an opportunity for you to think about their biases, do they actually stop and think, wait, hold on a second, I do make these implicit biases and I don't even realise I've done it. So I think we need to have conversations like that where we start to identify some of these implicit biases that we do have inherently, you know, and they don't just come from kind of what we see in the media and what we read and what we experience, but what we experience on a day-to-day, but also, you know, what we've been told as a person of Indian heritage. My mum has always told me there'll only be a certain limit I can reach in the white man's world, and I've grown up with that. And you know, she's basing it on her experiences. But that's what you grow up with. So then it's up to you to decide, well, actually, am I going to take that as kind of almost an excuse for where I get to in life, or am I going to use it to empower myself to actually say, I'm not going to put limitations on myself because of my race? Or, you know, there's so much, I guess what I'm now trying to show is there's so much complexity in this. And there isn't going to be a simple solution. Actually, it's going to be multidimensional, and it's going to have to happen at so many different levels. And in essence, we're going to have to start to prepare ourselves for those changes to come, because they're not by any means going to be easy or comfortable. I feel like I've spoken for ages now, so I'm going to shut up now.
I think what you're saying is something about developing our own self-awareness, which is key. Because we're not self-aware and not prepared to work at that, but also take a little bit of a risk sometimes in kind of putting ourselves out there in terms of just testing things out a bit, both with colleagues, but also most particularly with our organisation. So you talked a little bit about the organisation as well. It's leadership, it's about values, isn't it? And understanding our role, both as well, some of us will be clinicians, others working in other areas in our organisations. Being prepared, though, to be out there and challenge where challenge is needed and where it's appropriate. So, Riya, thank you so much. That's a great start to the webinar. I think we can probably go over to questions now, Sophie, if that's all right.
Yep, that's absolutely fine. I have a question in from Abdullah. Where I was in my childhood and where I am now is very different. The real acceptance begins with myself, and as I learn to accept my wholeness, sometimes the other may feel challenged on numerous levels of exchange. The question Abdullah would like to ask is, how do we help the other deal with that change process in that encounter? And I will put this to Riya.
Okay, can I just ask for a clarification? So by the other, do we mean other people you're around, or the other self
person you would encounter?
I think this is a difficult one, but ultimately it just comes back to you as people. We are constantly changing. You know, we're growing, we taking new information and we process new information. Actually, sometimes that will then result in us changing our initial beliefs, or maybe even coming to terms with difficult parts of our aspects of our identity and wanting to change it. And when that happens, notably, people around us are going to either feel not a loss, but feel like, oh, well, this isn't how you are. And this kind of just relates to, so for me, I find that when I don't know if I'm going to do this question justice, so I'm going to apologise in advance, but when you start to change as an individual and people can't really accept that change, I think there is an onus on you in the sense of you can't make somebody accept the change that's happened in you. That's not your responsibility. And so it's thinking, actually, you know, if I'm making a change and I'm making a change for the betterment of myself, and if somebody around me can't accept that, how much control do you actually have over that individual? And for me, I don't have control over how people perceive me, how people want to accept me, how people want to interpret me, or take me as a person. I don't have any control over that. I can't control your mind. I can't control your cognitions. I can't control your interpretations. But what I can control is what I'm doing and who I am and how I proceed in life. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things to come to terms with. Certainly for me, it's been throughout my life, that's been the hardest decisions, because I'm a big people pleaser. I struggle when people don't like me. I struggle when people don't get on with me. And so one of the most, in that situation, that's how I comfort myself. And that's what I would suggest to others. You know, if somebody can't accept a change you've made in your life, why would you want to stop that change if that change has brought about a lot of benefits? I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Guy, but
I'm not sure I do. Thank you, Riya. I mean, there's something about, from what I heard from Abdullah's question around the change and the now and then, and what happens when the other, when you I suppose it sounds a bit like becoming mature, the maturity that happens and can happen and should happen over a period of time, but how then difference is recognised and affirmed. Shall we go for the next question, Sophie?
Okay. A question from Ginny. How much of our identity do you feel can be consciously adopted or rejected, and how much do you feel is innate or subconsciously adopted? That was for Riya.
That's a very big question, very bold question. I guess part of my initial kind of response to that question is, how much of your identity are you actually aware of? And for, you know, in order for you to consciously be aware of who you are in a time and space, or a particular time and space, how in tune with yourself are you? So that's kind of one aspect. And two, I think initially it comes down to how well do you know yourself. So some people are very deeply introspective, and they will reflect on who they are, how they are in certain situations, and you know, may have like an internal debrief with themselves of, you know, did I represent myself appropriately? Did I reflect who I am, or could I have done something differently, depending on the situation and the scenario? But I think sometimes in all of the different roles and responsibilities and all the different identities we hold, it becomes quite difficult. Because of the complex nature of identity, it becomes difficult to know, actually, you know, in this situation, I let this part of my identity down because I didn't express this view, or I didn't express my whole identity here, and actually it was an opportunity to. And I think this is where we have to have compassion towards ourselves as well, because, you know, there might be an opportunity in a conversation or a context for you to say something that's really, really crucial, but it may not be appropriate, or the person in front of you may not be ready. And so this then comes back to kind of, if the person in front of you is not ready, or the situation wasn't appropriate, have you really let yourself down, or have you just thought about the situation you're in and made a conscious decision not to do something? But yeah, that's kind of my response to that.
It's a sort of question you could. I mean, it's an excellent question. It's something you could always do a PhD doctorate on, in terms of you know, how much of our identity do we feel is consciously adopted or rejected, and then, you know, what is innate, what do we adopt that is just we're not conscious of, and there must be a huge amount of stuff that's there that we're not conscious of, and how we make that conscious, how we develop our self-awareness, I guess, is the key, isn't it?
Yeah, and also some people, you know, you can have innate traits in you, and until a situation presents itself, you may not even know those exist. And again, it comes back to, how does somebody make you aware of certain traits or certain things that you do that you may not even be aware of? And yeah, it just comes back to what situations those things come back out in, and also how they're addressed. Because if somebody picks out a particularly a quirk, we'll call it, in you, how do they pick it out? You know, do they make you feel ashamed? Do they make you feel bad? Or do they say, oh, have you noticed you do this? So there's self-awareness, but there's also the individuals that are kind of making you aware of these things, particularly innate traits, but things that you do, I guess the things that you learn, it's also being aware, where have you learned them from, and, you know, and why have you learned them? Yeah, I could probably write an entire series of thesis on that, and still not be done.
Thanks, Riya, very much. Sophie, for the next question.
Okay, this one is for Riya from Simon, who would like to thank you for sharing your journey, and also would like to ask, is it confusing to try to integrate your British background with your family's African and Indian roots? Do you feel almost torn or pressurized to decide where your affiliation should be? And also, is the goal to be a person being happy with yourself, celebrating your diversity, and if so, how do you do that?
That's a very big question. I should probably also add, with life, so I'll share something. This is me being vulnerable to an extent. I actually belong to a Christian faith. I converted from a Hindu faith very many years ago, and it was a decision I made, and my family were not happy with that decision. And in terms of my identity, with my parents having their heritage and my British heritage, it is something I've struggled with for the majority of my life, if I'm being completely honest, because I was always the child at school where I wasn't brown enough for the brown kids and I wasn't white enough for the white kids. So it's kind of like, where do I fit? And for me, when I made the decision to convert, my family's initial reaction was I was trying to be a completely different ethnicity, and it was almost like they also stripped me of my cultural and my ethnic heritage, because it was like, what do you mean you're abandoning your Hindu faith and you're going down a Christian route? And so for me, that pivotal moment to make a decision to join a different faith or to affiliate with a different faith meant I started to go on this own journey where actually, who am I in this world became more at the forefront, more important than, you know, who my parents expect me to be in my faith and my culture, and who this world might expect me to be in my faith and my culture. And I think along that journey, I've actually grown closer to my culture, closer to my heritage than previously, because I no longer, I think instead of trying to fit into either box, for me personally, what I've done is I've realised I can exist in both of those worlds, and I don't, you know, I don't have to make a choice. You know, I am British, but I am also of Indian and African descent, and that's okay. Those that, you know, they're not incompatible identities. And whilst I'm not completely at self-actualization and completely there on my journey, just finding what's important to me has been helpful. So for me, my faith has been a big crux because it's allowed me to celebrate who I am, but it's also allowed me to appreciate that I don't have to make a choice between, you know, being Indian or being British. I can, there's other things, there's, I guess, higher beliefs that will guide me and kind of inform my decisions. And so I think going along this journey of trying to find who you are as a person and who you want to be in terms of your authentic self, it doesn't mean that you have to give up aspects of your cultural heritage or your faith background, or even your identity as a woman, or any of the different roles that we have. It's more just, you know, as corny as it's going to sound, you know, when I look in the mirror, who do I want to see? Who do I want to be seen as? What do I want to be recognised by? And those are the things that it doesn't matter what cultural or faith background you're from, because they're you know, there's a deeper sense of connectedness. So, you know, I don't want to be remembered as the brown Indian girl that had a degree in psychology. Rather, I have meaning and purpose, and, you know, there are other characteristics I want to be remembered by. So, and get into a place of acceptance, you know, I don't have to sit at a table and prove how brown I am. And equally, I don't have to sit at a table and prove how British I am. I know who I am, and that's the empowering nature of accepting who you are outside of those identities. If that makes sense.
Can I just make a comment there? Thank you, Riya, very much indeed, and for being a little bit, you know, being prepared to be a bit vulnerable there. And that sense, that what struck me was the fact that initially moving away from your own Hindu faith tradition and becoming part of a Christian faith tradition, there were real pressures on you. But what you've discovered, that sort of self-actualization, that realization, is that actually you're not being moved away. If anything, you're moving much more towards integrating your own culture. And I suppose I struggle a little bit when I understand the question, but the word affiliation doesn't seem quite right to me, does it?
No.
No. Savis.
Okay. Aloma would like to know, biases have a significant impact on how we interact with others, but how much of a role do norms play in how we value diversity? That was for Riya.
I think my view of norms is that they're a bit like emotions in the sense that they're fickle, they're subject to change. So, you know, what was normal 20 years ago may not be normal now. And I think in terms of diversity, that's something we need to be embracing, you know. What was previously, so for example, given this pandemic, previously the thought of wearing a face mask was kind of absurd. It was like, no, why am I wearing a face mask? What do I need to wear a face mask for? But actually, slowly, after exploring, you know, why we need to make this a new norm, you know, what's the reasoning behind wearing a face mask? It protects us and it protects those around us, and it just reduces the transmission of COVID-19. So it's a public health safety measure. And it's the same when we think about diversity. Some of the things that we put into place in relation to improving our diversity goals, they will eventually become normal the more we do it. But it's getting that initial engagement going and challenging the existing norms. So, you know, in terms of our societal structures, we know that there are things that are normal that shouldn't be normal. So with particular reference to kind of hiring practices, we know there are certain companies that hit a certain quota in terms of their diversity, and that's it, and it's a tick box exercise. But actually, if we introduce an element of accountability and start to challenge some of these norms, the new norm is going to change, or a new norm is going to form, and that then is going to bring about a new cycle of change. And so I think, you know, yes, there are norms in which society is governed by, but in relation to diversity, what we also need to acknowledge is those norms are not, they're not static and are staying in place. They are subject to change, and by challenging them, we are then going to bring about a new normal, and we can do that as human beings, as seen by the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, we can quickly adapt. It's just making the conscious choice to want to make those changes. I don't know if that's answered the question, but yeah.
I'm sure it does, Riya, very much so. I think the idea that actually there can be new norms, we can develop new norms, is a rather wonderful one. And change can evolve. We can evolve. Thank you. Sophie's.
Okay, I am conscious of time, so a couple more questions. Okay, there is an unsaid feeling experienced by diverse communities that there is parts of host community that there should be an assimilation of identity. Your thoughts and reflections.
I think assimilation is really interesting. And again, I say this as somebody who can assimilate to a lot of different contexts. And by that, I mean, if I'm in a kind of setting where there are a lot of well-spoken people, my accent becomes very, very strong. And I like to really make that forward, that, and I don't know why I do that, but I'm very conscious of it when I do it. Or when you're in a situation where certain aspects of you don't want them to be misread, then certain levels of assimilation happen. But I think this comes back to what I was trying to say earlier. And again, I'm fully aware that it's probably a very idealistic, euphoric view of society, what potentially could be. But when you think about assimilation, you know, what are we trying to assimilate to? So by that, I mean, kind of, you know, we live in a country that's as diverse as England. we have laws and we follow those laws. So I can assimilate myself in the sense of I can follow the laws and regulations of the land, but you know, does assimilation then mean I can't do things that would be completely normal in my culture? And so it's kind of differentiating between, for me anyway, you know, is there something in particular that British culture does that doesn't happen in South Asian culture? And if that's the case, why do I have to give it up? And it's, again, it comes back to how rooted something is in you, because there was a time where, again, thinking specifically in my own experiences, where wearing my traditional clothing in a public setting, I'd find it highly embarrassing because I'm like, oh my God, I look so different. But now I look for an opportunity where I could, you know, wear my traditional clothes and be proud of that. And again, that comes from, I think, the need and the want to assimilate comes from wanting to belong. But if we bring it back to, if you are happy and comfortable and acceptance of yourself or accepting of yourself, there's just a whole different way in which you then carry about yourself and go about life. And it's just having the confidence to do that. Again, that's not, I don't know if that answers the question, but from my own experiences, you need to appreciate what your culture, what your heritage, what your faith is, and be proud of it. Once you have that essence and that feeling, you know, I don't mind being different. Whereas when I was growing up, I hated the fact that I was different. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense, Riya. Absolutely. I'm conscious of the time, and we're probably approaching, well, I know we're approaching the end of our webinar, so I'll hand over to Juliet in a moment, but I did want to just pass on a couple of comments from the chat. Someone says, thank you for sharing with us, Riya, and being vulnerable with us, brave and appreciated. Simon, in response to his question, that was an amazing answer. Thank you. There is a question around measurement tools, which I think is a really important one, and perhaps we might be able to kind of respond to that a little later on the chat. The question's asking about, you know, in terms of organisations and questionnaires, how well are we doing, and in terms of what you described. I don't know. Yeah, I was tempted to ask you, but I won't, because we're now 2 minutes to. So I'll hand over to Juliet. But thank you so much, Riya and Juliet.
Hi, thank you. Thanks very much for that, Guy. Yes, we will wrap up the seminar now. We only have a couple more minutes to go. Thank you so much, Riya, for being so open and thoughtful in what you're sharing. That you know, it was just a very authentic presentation, I would say. So thank you for that. That's a really great contribution. So I'd just like to ask the people attending, if they don't mind, if in the Q&A section, it would be very helpful if you could please rate this webinar. How useful was it for you on a scale of 1 to 5? And if you could also type any feedback or thoughts you may have about this webinar and what worked well or what we could improve for the future, that would be really helpful as well. Thank you. And I'll just give you half a minute to do that. And the next bit, sorry, I haven't queued up the right slide, my mistake. So just to finish off, we have 3 more webinars in the series. For full details, go to the web address appearing on the slide, and I think Sophie is going to put the link in the question and answer section as well, so you can click on that directly. Thank you, Sophie. Our next webinar will be Feeling an Outsider Within Your Own Organisation with Brian Natanga on Tuesday 25th of January from 4 till 5. feeling outside it within your own organisation, question mark. It's like important to highlight that. And just a reminder that all of these webinars are being recorded and will be put on the webpage later. And on that note, thank you everyone for coming and have a good evening.